You're in the Maloney Sunday School class, and my name is Dick Carter, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you for being here. I have, as we always do, a list of individuals we might want to be thinking about, and provided by my friend David. And so I will rely on you all to be much more in touch with them than I was. But Dana Eminger obviously is mourning the loss of her husband. And anybody be in touch with her? Sharon? Oh, Jane Evinger?
Oh, Jane, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And then Mark Siltander lost his wife, or his daughter, excuse me, his sister, Sue. That's, I went through all of the possible relationships. Oh my goodness. Okay. John Lynch, the son-in-law of Bob and Pidge Osborne, died on June 13th. Katie Parker's mother, Margaret McKersey, died June 17th. Meg O'Brien's father died June 22nd. It's been a bad week. Elizabeth Jackson is undergoing cancer treatment. Anybody been in track with that? Okay. George Ramsey was a cancer patient under hospice. Sharon looks like she's nodding her head. Anything you can fill us on that?
I didn't see George this week.
Okay. But you have in the past, haven't you, been in touch with him? Okay.
I will be.
Ed Townsend is under care of hospice. Mike Palmer is under care of hospice. Ann Coffey is undergoing cancer treatment. And we have need to end on a positive note. The birth of Mackenzie Slagle on June 17th. The parents are Barry and Amy Slagle, who are members of the church. So there's a positive note to end on.
Does this list appear on the DCPC website somewhere? There's a couple of people who really.
Yes, that's where they.
Yeah, anyone that can fill in, any other information with regards to our friends and brothers and
Is
sisters?
Elizabeth Jackson Bill Jackson's daughter?
I think
Okay,
it's Judy and Bill.
She used to be in our
I think
choir.
it's Judy and Bill.
Judy and Bill?
I
Is that what you
believe
said?
it is
Yeah.
Judy and Bill's daughter.
Okay. The,
Elizabeth.
I apologize, I overloaded you with information there, but at least we'll try to keep up with that. As you probably know, we all try to have a monthly theme, and month of July is my month. It also happens to be my birthday, by the way. I'm not going to admit to you how many years that is. But we're...
Well, excuse me, has anybody heard from Barbara? Because I'm reminded that Barbara, it was her responsibility. I hope she can hear us. It was Barbara's responsibility to keep up with birthdays, and since she hasn't been here, nobody's had a birthday.
Exactly, and which is good news.
So I hope if Barbara's watching you, you can tell her we miss her. And
Yes.
nobody has aged since she's been gone.
You realize that, Barbara, you are institutional memory that we're currently lacking.
We need you, Barbara.
So happy birthday to everyone who has a birthday, an unknown birthday today.
Yes.
My intention is to fulfill during this month the theme. And my theme is, since we haven't, due to the pandemic, had the opportunity to gather, I'll pick it up. I just got a message that I need to have this put down. Pardon me. We haven't had a chance to gather together, so we're going to talk about gathering together, and I'm going to do it historically, in fact, prehistorically, because we're going to talk about first, just today, talk about the cave people, and why in the world would they gather together? Why would cavemen gather together? How about security?
Safety.
Have you ever heard the analogy of the cave?
The projection.
You know, they all had fires, and small animals would walk in front of the fire and cast a large shadow on the wall behind them. And they came to the conclusion that those were not small animals, they were large animals, and that they needed security from them. So they built the fire up higher, which caused more animals to walk around. In any event, the analogy of the cave was an interesting thing because it was a discussion of perception. You know, and they were perceiving that they were in danger, so they gathered together. Were there family units in the cave days?
Probably.
Probably, yeah. I think there's reason to believe that. Was there spirituality? Did they have a faith? They had been created by our God. Did they retain something of that? Did they have a faith? They certainly had something that protected them spiritually, right? And so maybe that's part of what they began to come to believe, that there was someone looking out for them, or a being looking out for them. But in any event, that's that. I'm gonna quote, this is "We Gather Together," number 336 in the hymnal. And this may have come from history. "We gather together to ask the Lord's blessing. He chastens and hastens his will to make known. The wicked oppressing now cease from distressing. Sing praises to his name. He forgets not his own." Here's two. "Beside us to guide us, our God with us joining, ordaining, maintaining his kingdom divine. So from the beginning the fight we are winning. Thou Lord, waste our side," that's interesting, "wast our side," was, I believe. "All glory be thine." That's the first time I found a typo in the hymnal. "We all do extol thee, thou leader in triumphant, and pray that thou still our defender will be. Let thy congregation escape tribulation, thy name be ever praised, O Lord, make us free." So a little bit of defending themselves is right there. We have one more little thing. This is from Matthew 18, verse 20. "Again I tell you this, if two of you agree on earth about any request you have to make, that request will be granted by my heavenly Father. For where two or three have met together in my name, I am there among them." And I presume that he is with us. We have the joy of Heather McKee and her wisdom, I get to call it Heather, this morning. Any other things that we should do in preparation? You get the mic.
I get the mic.
Yeah,
Worldwide artist. Good morning, everybody. It is great to see you all in person. It's been a long time. Let's open with a word of prayer. Divine Creator, we come together today grateful for the opportunity to gather, to be here with one another today in this sanctuary, in this on this beautiful day. We ask that your presence be among us as we tackle some sometimes overlooked texts that are difficult to understand. May your wisdom and guidance be with us during this time. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Amen. So it is wonderful to be with you, and today we have an opportunity to dig into one of the oft overlooked texts in the Torah, in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Leviticus. How often have you ever heard a sermon on Leviticus? Not very often, right? It's a book that's frequently misunderstood, often misused, and has a bit of an ick factor in a lot of places. But it's really a rich and important text. And we're going to talk quite a bit about it today because I didn't want to miss this opportunity to kind of dig into some of the scholarship around the book. So Leviticus is the third book of the Torah, and it's traditionally called the Vayikra. And that means he, the Lord, called. And as a point of convention, the books in the first five, the Torah, are named in Hebrew after the first verse usually. So the Vayikra. It's also called the Torat Kohanim, and that means instructions for the priests. And then there's the Greek name Leviticon, which are things pertaining to the Levites. And as you probably remember, the priests are of the tribe of Levi. So this kind of focuses us on the book's main concern, which are the commandments connected to the worship of God, which the priests are responsible for. So the setting of Leviticus is part of a long narrative, actually, that extends from Exodus chapter 25 all the way through Numbers 10. And that, scholars call that narrative when the tabernacle stood at Sinai. And it begins with God's instructions to Moses to provide a portable residence for Yahweh, the divine presence, and to set aside a group that would be the priests, which are Aaron and his lineage down the line. So the tabernacle is also the place where God meets regularly with Moses to impart his laws. And it's also called the Ohel Moed, which is the tent of meeting. So this tent of meeting or tabernacle is manufactured at the foot of Mount Sinai. And then that's where all the laws are conveyed. The priests and the Levites and the remaining tribes are all brought together there and given instructions later for the journey to Canaan, and then they depart from there to Sinai. So we know that this book, Leviticus, is part of a larger narrative, but what about when it was written? So, as we've talked about before, most of the texts that we have in the Hebrew Bible were written much later than the setting would suggest. So scholars look at Leviticus, and one common point of agreement is that this text was written from the perspective of a source that scholars called P. So if you remember back when we started talking about the documentary hypothesis, it's a long time ago, but we have Julius Wellhausen, who was a very influential German Hebrew Bible scholar, posited that there were three major sources, JEPD, of text, of information in the Hebrew Bible. So this documentary hypothesis has become a lot more complicated and somewhat contentious among scholars today, but generally speaking, there's pretty much consensus and agreement that the Levitical material is from this P source. So now, when was that P source, doing their editing and compiling? Well, there's some disagreement. Some folks think that the materials we find in the first part of Leviticus, and we'll talk some more about how it's kind of divided. Some folks think that these materials had been around for a while, and that during the pre-exilic period, so before the Israelites were sent to Babylon, that all of these laws and this information started to be compiled. But that's not a universal claim. Now, some also think that, as I mentioned, that the book of Leviticus is divided into kind of two major sections. And so we'll have 1 through 16, these are chapters, and then 17 onward, I think, to 26. So we're going to be looking at this section primarily today, because we're going to look at sections 13 and 14. But I want to talk a little bit about what scholars think this division is. Now, we said that the P source is responsible for the entirety of the book. But this second part, you may have heard of the term the Holiness Code. Now, the Holiness Code, many scholars think, is a later addition to the book, and that it was likely a result of a post-exilic experience, that the writers of the H portion, the Holiness Code, had gone through the exile, and when they were returning to the land of Israel, they had some different perspectives on what it meant to form an identity and what was required of someone who was an Israelite. So they have kind of a different ideological interest, a different set of concerns. But I want to emphasize the point that Leviticus has a lot of ethical material in it. And a lot of that is embedded in this H source stuff in the Holiness Code. One that comes to mind to me is how the Israelites are to treat foreigners. That's in that section of Leviticus. And that'll be important as we move into our Lucan text in a few minutes. So the H source is a little bit of a polemic, a little bit of a critique of this earlier 1 through 16. And it represents to Israel a post-exilic perspective on identity creation and laws. And if you remember when we talked about Ezra and Nehemiah, remember they had those two books presented that post-exilic return, and there were concerns about maintaining the identity. You know, don't marry foreign women stuff. So there's some differences between these two sections of the book. Rabbi Tamara Cohn Eskenazi, who I read quite a bit in preparation for this class today, notes that Leviticus presupposes a kind of religiosity that we might call temple religion, or cultic concerns. So while the dramatic setting is Israel wandering in, after Exodus prior to coming to the Promised Land, but the text really reflects the interests of a settled society. Okay? So the tent of meeting in the text is a stand-in for the temple. Okay? And the encampment is analogous to the territory of Israel, and the environs around it are separate, and they're Gentile territory. So if we think of these as kind of superimposed circles, then according to the scriptural scholar Jacob Milgram, you can think of the closer to the temple or the dwelling of God, the holier one must be, or the holier that place is, which is to say purer. So Israel is called to reflect a concern for purity that isn't incumbent upon those outside of that circle. So if we think about the Jewish practices and even some Christian theologies that have arisen out of this very intense concern about purity, yet when we look at the Hebrew words, and we'll talk a little bit more, there really isn't a good English translation for what is translated as impurity or uncleanliness. So, but what we can say is that God is certainly considered holy and pure, and God cannot tolerate impurities. So according to the peace source, the community of Israel has to keep itself pure to ensure God's continued presence in the text, the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, and then at the time of the writing, in the temple. So that dwelling place of the divine presence must be marked off, cordoned off, maintained to be pure. And like some of the other ancient Near Eastern religions, the Israelites believed that their deity, Yahweh, could reside simultaneously in the temple, in the divine, the Holy of Holies, but also in heaven. And that the earthly temple is actually a replica of the heavens of its heavenly counterpart. So if impurity is not disposed of and allowed to accumulate, then guess what? God may leave the sanctuary, may leave the temple, and that would bring on national disaster. So while we were assigned only one verse of the Levitical text, I hope you'll bear with me a little bit longer, because I want to kind of dive into chapters 13 and 14, which talk about, kind of give you a larger frame of this ritual approach to skin disease. And I want to start out by saying that, and I have a nurse in the room, that what these texts are not referring to Hansen's disease. Right. Hansen's disease is what, in our modern parlance is leprosy. But the term that's used in these texts is different. So I want to dig into some scholarship here. And this is from Sam Ballantyne, who cites Rabbi Jacob Milgram talking about this first half of Leviticus, which is the chapters 1 through 16. And what Milgram notices is that chapters 1 through 16 present 10 Torot, 10 commandments. Not unsurprisingly, there's usually numbers matter, tens, and then we'll talk about sevens too. So the first 5 instructions in Leviticus concern sacrifice. So they're the instructions to the priests. There's the burnt offering, the cereal offering, the purification offering, the reparation offering, and the well-being offering. But the second 5 Torot provide instructions concerning impurity. The first, in chapter 11, talks about animal carcasses. The second, childbirth. The third, skin diseases. And then in conjunction with that, the purification of skin diseases, which is chapter 14. And then the genital discharges, the yuck factor. So these 10 Torah clearly have to do with priestly matters. But when you look at them closely, you'll see that the laity, the regular Israelites, are also active participants in much of this. That the sacrifices must be offered by the people at the holy sanctuary, where the rituals at the altar require the administration of the priests. But the sacrificial system itself depends as much on the laity's understanding and participation as it does to the priests. And the priests are kind of seen as educators. So they are imparted with the responsibility of conveying to the people what is required to keep God in God's holy place. And to identify that as which is clean and unclean. So diving into chapter 13, skin diseases. So we are now talking about the 8th and 9th Torahs in these chapters. So God instructs Moses and Aaron to address 7 types of skin conditions that can make a person unclean. There's shiny patches, discolorations, boils, burns, sores on the scalp and in the beard, rashes or blisters, and bald spots on the head that are discolored. And as I referred to earlier, the medical terms that we use for these are just really a matter of conjecture. I mean, I've read a lot of stuff where, this is psoriasis, or this is eczema, and I just think that's purely speculation of what they thought it was. But it really is kind of irrelevant when we think about the interpretive process, because by listing there's 7 diseases, what we understand from reading our Hebrew text is 7 is often a number that means what? Complete. Yeah. So the actual intent of listing 7 is to say this encompasses all of them. But the condition that is described first provides some essential criteria for the diagnosis and paradigm for response that the priests have to understand. So it's that scaly disease. Just as an aside, as I was going through this, I was like, wow, I bet our ministers of Word and Sacrament are glad that they don't have to do this. Could you imagine? You have to get a second degree in dermatology. We all have to go present to them before we can enter the sanctuary. But that aside, the priests are instructed to look for 3 symptoms, which is swelling, eruption, or a shiny spot. So if any of these symptoms occur, then the priest declares the person ceremonially unclean, which removes the person from that first inner level, right? Okay. So then there are some steps. After 7 days, the priest goes back, and if the condition hasn't abated, then the person is unclean. They are sarat. So, S-A-R-A-T. So they are now considered to be unclean. And so once that happens, there are certain behaviors that the person who is deemed impure or unclean has to adopt. And that actually, our text from Leviticus describes that. And the persons who are deemed sarat must tear their clothes, dishevel their hair, cover their mouths, and cry out, unclean, unclean, unclean. So this symbolic enactment of affliction confirms that they know themselves that they have become repugnant to the community and that they are deemed a threat to the holiness of God. And they have to cry out in warning lest anybody get too close to their impurity. And they do have to banish themselves from the community and live outside of the camp during the duration of their affliction, where they're isolated, can't make a living, and they can't observe any of the holy statutes and ordinances, which in their community is part of the fullness of being human. So it really is, a hard situation to be in. So they now reside in a place of deprivation, shame, and abandonment. And in many ways, they are the living dead. And the only thing that stands between that and them is the priests coming back and saying, you are clean. So if they can, get better, then that can happen. So they just have to wait and hope. But let's say that someone does become healed, become no longer afflicted. They're still not clean until they undergo some rituals with the priest. So chapter 14 of the text talks about this movement away from affliction and banishment to restoration. And it's ritually enacted through an 8-day process that's comprised of 3 stages. And interestingly, the length of the process recalls the priestly paradigm for God's creation of the world. So in its own way, the ritual ceremony is itself kind of a creative act. So when the person has presented as healed from the skin disease, the priest goes outside the camp to inspect them. And then once the priest has said that the disease has disappeared, the priest initiates the ritual process. And from this point on, the person is no longer referred to as skin diseased, but one who is to be cleansed. So that transition is mediated by a priest. But then there are some other ritual requirements. So when the person who no longer presents with the disease comes to the priest for this ritual, the person must bring some offerings. 2 birds. This is for the first go around, okay? To be considered clean. They have to bring 2 birds, cedar wood, crimson yarn, and hyssop. Okay? Now, Milgram and others think that the birds symbolize the ability to transport the impurity out. And the cedar wood and crimson yarn are both red materials, and they were selected because the color is similar to blood, which the priestly rituals associate with the power of life. And then hyssop, which I think is like a little weed or herb or something, is associated with purification because it acts like a sponge. It's kind of a spongy plant. So when you dip it in liquid, it leaves and retains enough moisture that you can rub it on something. So all of these symbols come together, and that is the first step. So that's the 7th day. And then the person being cleansed also has to wash their clothes, shave, bathe their body, and each act is kind of a ritual of cleansing and new life that helps them, that symbolically prepares them to re-enter this holy world. But there's one more thing that the ritual requires, and that's on the 8th day. And these are the sacrifices that complete a transition from from death to life, and ritually enact the joy and commitment of those who know themselves to be reinstated in the community. So again, the person who wishes to be cleansed has to come with offerings. And in this case, on the 8th day, 2 male lambs without blemish, 1 yearling ewe lamb, a cereal offering of 3/10 of an ephah of flour, and a measure of oil. So the person has to bring these to the priest, and the priest will perform the rituals. Now, all of these things require what? Yeah. But there's a proviso in the text that says whether if one is well-to-do or poor, the prescriptions are presumed to apply to all. But you can make some less expensive substitutes. 1 male lamb, 1/10 of an ephah of flour, and 2 turtles or pigeons. So you can get a discount if you can't afford it. But the priest takes all of these and dips his finger in oil and sprinkles it 7 times around the person. And then through these acts, the priest effects atonement, at-one-ment, a restoration, a coming back into the circle. So it effectively sets right and reconciles whatever improper contact the diseased person may have had with the holy things of God. And once this reconciliation is complete, the person is free to enter the sanctuary again and to resume full participation in the rituals and life of the community. So one thing I want to point out as we segue into our Lucan text, and we'll have some discussion, you'll notice when you read 13 and 14 that the priest does not himself cure or arrest the disease. The function of the priest is to declare what is pure, what is impure, what is clean, what is not clean, and then through ritual restore the afflicted individual to a full life within the community. Okay? So keep that in mind. So we're going to move to our Lucan text. I think I have that. And it's a short pericope, meaning a short little section. And it's chapter 17. And it's the healing of the 10 who may or may not have Hansen's disease. We don't know. But I'll read it to you. It's Luke 17, verse 11. So on the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. So let's look at that. Here's Galilee. Here's Samaria. Remember, Jesus was up here in Capernaum, so he's traveling down through here. Okay. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him, keeping their distance. They called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." They didn't say, "Clean, unclean, unclean, unclean." They said, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go show yourselves to the priests." Okay? That sounds like what they're supposed to do when their affliction has left them. And as they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God, except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well." Or, alternate readings in the Greek, "Your faith has made you clean." So, here we are in the Gospel of Luke. What are some of the concerns when we think about, this particular Gospel and the writer Luke? What are some things that are important to Luke when he's conveying his story? The physician, right? What are some other themes? Right. Okay. So in the Lucan Gospel, there's a great concern about people who are marginalized. So the folks who are oppressed. In fact, if I can find it real quick, Jesus' first sermon in the synagogue, he kind of tells us, I think it's Luke 4. Jesus here in Luke 4:18 finds the scroll of Isaiah and says, this is essentially his mission statement, according to the Gospel of Luke. "Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." So, great deal of concern about those who are oppressed or marginalized and these around him. Any other themes that strike you about Luke's Gospel? Okay.
Speaks a lot to faith.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and he says as much. Your faith has made you well, or your faith has made you clean. And actually, in the text, I think it's before this or after this, but very close, Jesus says to the disciples, if you had the faith of a mustard seed. So you're right, it's a very important theme within the Gospel of Luke. So, but if you'll notice in this text, remember I said that the priest doesn't heal. Jesus is healing here. Now, prior to this, we have stories of Jesus healing. And in fact, earlier in the gospel, Jesus has already healed somebody with a skin disease. So by now, the reader or the hearer of Luke's gospel will know that healing is part of Jesus' identity, part of Jesus' being, that separates him from the priests. But at the same time, what does Jesus tell the 10 to do? He says to go to the priests. Right? Right. And that's another element of the Gospel of Luke that sometimes gets overlooked in Christian circles, which is that the author, while Jesus has strong critiques in these texts of Pharisees and Sadducees and other establishment elites in Jerusalem, Jesus remains very much embedded in his Jewish faith and traditions. And that would have been important, again, to the hearers and the readers of this gospel, because another characteristic of the Gospel of Luke is that we think that it was written mainly for a Gentile audience. So the author is saying Jesus is not rejecting Judaism. Jesus is embedded in it. But Jesus is, in ways unlike the religious establishment, transcendent of it. So, yeah, the messianic elements of this too. Jesus has fulfilled it. Any other observations on this transition? Another thing I noticed is, as is the case with all the other healing little pericopes, Jesus does not ask to be paid, does not ask for a turtle dove or a ram. But what does Jesus kind of ask for? And a sense of recognition of where that power is coming from. Yeah. Right. And the one who recognizes that is a Samaritan, not one of the Jewish other 9, but a Samaritan. Some of the scholarship I read made kind of a deal about the Samaritan and kind of literalized this journey that Jesus was on, would have started around Capernaum, coming down through here, that if you're on the borders of Samaria and Judea, Jerusalem's down here, but a Samaritan would not go to Jerusalem to see a priest. A Samaritan would go to Mount Gerizim, which is up here. So they said, well, maybe, the Samaritan hung around because he was going north, the others were going south. I think that, who knows. But clearly, we know from other stories in Luke and throughout the gospel that the Samaritans and the Jews were enemies and on the opposite side of the theological debate, even though they shared kind of a common theological origin. But the Samaritans thought God lived at Mount Gerizim, and the Jewish folks down Mount Sinai, down in the temple in Jerusalem. So.
Back to Leviticus.
Uh-huh.
When I first read this, there's a contradiction in chapter 19. They talk about no prejudice against foreigners or outside.
Right.
Except everybody. Yet these people were isolated in a group community. They were lepers back in the early sections. But you may have explained part of this by suggesting that second portion of Leviticus may have been added later.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if when that happened, they might have revised their own methods of dealing with the lepers if they know.
That's a really good point, Gordon, because we don't really know how these laws were put into practice during Jesus' time, because if you understand that these first 16 chapters are an earlier version, and then, as you said, the Holiness Code comes and rewrites or revises or adds new things to it. How did that play out, or in Jesus' time? So I haven't seen a real good answer to that. But the text in Luke gives us a sense, though, that Jesus critiques the priests and the Sadducees and Pharisees for burdening the people with the law and not lifting a finger to remove those burdens. So reading between the lines a little bit, I kind of come away thinking that there was, some pretty strict interpretation and enforcement around some of these laws that created real burdens for people. Pat?
With this dislike of Samaritans, we still have not learned this tons of years later to dislike certain groups.
That's absolutely right.
And that bothers me.
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't we learn way back that
That's
you
true.
just don't dislike one group?
Yeah, that prejudice and bias against certain groups. And we can talk about so many examples of that, but I want to touch on one that actually pertains to this text in Leviticus about lepers. I haven't been there yet, but I'd like to go. But I read a book about Father Damien. Maybe you all have heard of him. He was a Catholic priest who served in Hawaii. And on the island of Molokai, the state of Hawaii created a leper colony because there had been some outbreaks of Hansen's disease. Yeah. What's interesting? Yeah, it's a true story. True. Yeah. What's interesting, though, is that the book, and this is during the colonial era in Hawaii, meaning that the U.S. government was occupying, and you had indigenous Native Hawaiians who didn't like that. Now, the book talks about, yes, there were people who clearly had Hansen's disease, and they were sent away from Oahu or wherever they lived to this place on Molokai, which, if you've been to Hawaii or the Na Pali coast, you just know the coastline, how sheer the cliffs can be somewhere. So this settlement on Molokai was so isolated because it was like gated practically by these sheer cliffs and then the ocean. So it was like a Alcatraz in some ways, or a prison. So there were the folks that definitely had leprosy, but the government would use the threat of being diagnosed to quell any dissent. And the author of the book says that several people were sent to Molokai only because they were starting to stir up trouble. You know.
His name was Damien.
Yeah, Father Damien.
Yeah.
But he went there and stayed and ran the leper colony. And one of the things, and Sharon, you can correct me if I'm wrong, one of the things that I've read about Hansen's disease is that it's really not that communicable. They used to think, yeah, right, yeah, yeah. But when he went, he didn't have it, but by the time he did have it, and he died there. But you know, so this misunderstanding and stigmatizing of people who are lepers, not just affected those who actually had it, but was used as a cudgel and a threat against people who didn't have it at all, maybe. Yes?
That would describe in great detail the missionary's life and
the Torah. Interesting things in it that in our popular culture and even